I want us to look this morning at the gospel reading. And the minute you come to a gospel reading, one of the questions that I ask at least is, why 4 gospels? I suppose one of the reasons the Holy Spirit inspired 4 people to write the stories about Jesus is that, well, it's more than one witness. Perhaps 2, the Holy Spirit recognized, as I think we all do, that simply the account of one person fails to communicate the richness of a story. We benefit from hearing the same tale from different voices, and together they give us a fuller picture, in this case, of the life of Jesus, than otherwise we would be privileged to enjoy. But it's interesting to notice, in fact, the way in which the different gospel writers do present their stories. Mark is the action man, isn't he? All immediatelys and verbs, and even slipping into the present tense, rather like an excited child. I sees this, he does that, to bring us right into the story of what Mark is recounting to us. Then there's Luke, the more considered, the more academic, the more reflective, the person who gives us the sort of details that help us with it, those of us with imagination, to fill out the story and to imagine the scene for ourselves. And then there's Matthew, from which our gospel reading came this morning. Matthew, who is a words man. It's interesting as you read through Matthew's gospel, especially when he comes to the accounts of miracles, how he tells us the bare necessities of the story in order to focus in on the words. Now, if I was telling this story, especially if, as we might suppose, Matthew was an eyewitness, I think I would have made a lot more of it. The extent of the wind, the creaking of the boat, and so on. But Matthew cuts all those things out simply to tell us the story of Jesus coming to meet the disciples, walking on the water, and the 2 conversations that take place effectively. The flanking conversation, where in the face of their fears, Jesus says, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." And the ultimate response they give to that when they say together, "Truly, you are the Son of God." And then the conversation that takes place between Jesus and Peter. Now, the first thing I notice about the way in which Jesus approaches the disciples is he says something quite extraordinary. He says, "It is I am." Jesus is making a veiled claim here to his being incarnate deity. We're familiar with that in John's Gospel. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the good shepherd, and so on. The use of that terminology is far less frequent in the other Gospels. So when Matthew uses that phrase, I am, I'm sure we're intended to notice that. And if I may put it in these terms, Jesus here, having walked the walk, literally, is talking the talk. He's declaring what his walking on the water means to those who were the witnesses. I am, he says, incarnate deity. I am the one who is sovereign over creation itself. Sovereign because I am creation's Lord. Now that's interesting because one of the ways in which when Matthew tells his accounts of miracles, it's clear that, especially because of his emphasis upon words, that actually he sees the miracles as acted parables. They're intended to tell us not only something about Jesus, but how we are to respond to him as children of his kingdom. And so when Jesus appears to his disciples, he is intended to be seen to appear to you and to me too and say, take courage, it's I am. And we too are bidden to worship him. When Matthew uses that word, incidentally, you may know this already, it's a verb that's used only in the scriptures of the worship of deity. We might speak of the worshipful Mayor of London or whatever it is, but when the New Testament uses the language, it restricts it to the worship of God himself. So the disciples recognize incarnate deity and worship him. And I suggest to you that's the foundation of our faith too. Any faith that falls short of worshipping Jesus as incarnate deity is not true faith. It's not adequate faith. In fact, adequate is the word. It will prove insufficient for us in the midst of the challenges we find ourselves in. So there is the call here to recognize Jesus as incarnate deity and to take courage from that and to worship him for who he is. But then there's this conversation with Peter, where Peter, typically bold, responds to Jesus' appearance by saying, "Bid me come to you on the water." And Peter then performs an act which no human being apart from Jesus has ever done before or since. He walks on the water. Now, I've been doing a little bit of thought about verse 31 this week. You of little faith, why did you doubt? And it sounds like a bit of a criticism. But actually, I'm not sure that the word doubt there is the appropriate word. Why were you distracted? Peter was distracted by looking around and taking his eyes off Jesus. He was distracted. And Jesus is perhaps saying to him, I might have expected little else from you, Peter, because your faith is still at an early stage. You still only have little faith. Oh, you of little faith, he says, why were you distracted? And that's surely a challenge to you and to me too, that we're called to grow in our faith, to mature our faith, and to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, not on the things that so easily do distract us. The reality is, of course, that Peter was distracted by the waves around him. Wouldn't you have been? Wouldn't I have been? And there are so many things in our lives that are the means of distraction, trouble, distress. We can't fail to notice them, but we're called to keep our eyes on the incarnate Jesus. And the lovely thing about this story is, isn't it, that on the one hand, Jesus reveals himself as creation's Lord. But on the other hand, he reveals himself as the one who stretches out his hand and says, come, hold my hand, and I will lead you and keep you. The incarnate God of the universe is also a God who is deeply interested, who's profoundly loving towards you and to me. And in the light of that, we can face our own storms, the distractions that so often come our way, by placing our hand in his and knowing that he will not let us down. One of the great things about the Christian church, especially if I may say so, Anglicanism at this point, is the regularity with which the Holy Communion takes place. I come from traditions where they frequently celebrate the Lord's table more irregularly, and it's sometimes an add-on at the service where people can slip home on a Sunday morning and make sure that the roast hasn't burnt. I cherish the fact that the Lord's table is central to the life of the church with which I'm now committed, because our tradition has always affirmed that this is a means of grace. As we draw near to Jesus at the table, he draws near to us. As we stretch out our hand to him, his hand stretches out to us. And in a way that perhaps we cannot put into words, it's beyond words. This is one of those means that Jesus provides to us to enable us to grow in our faith, to focus our confidence in him, and to find his help in time of distraction.